I'm struggling to think of any MPs that or any ministers that have resigned or been forced to resign. I know Shazib Javid walked out of number 11, the chancellorship, back in, I think it was February of last year. But we've had Priti Patel admitted bullying, been found to have been bullying. Robert Jenrick, the housing minister, admitted apparent bias in overturning a planning decision in favour of a Conservative donor of Richard Desmond, a planning decision to do a massive development in East London, saving Desmond an estimated £40 million. We've had Gavin Williamson still in post despite this huge kind of running series of problems in education, and now we have Matt Hancock been found to have broken the law, and he is not going to, he will stay in post. We can see that. So I do think there's a real danger of a culture of impunity going on in government, and I think it is incumbent to try and hold government accountable, to push them, because it's quite clear that it's not going to come from within government. Boris Johnson's made really clear that if a minister is behind him, they have Boris Johnson's support unless he doesn't want them in his government, but he's not going to get rid of them because something they've done. I think it's there. A lot of government ministers probably are at that kind of Donald Trump on shooting a man on Fifth Avenue stage. You do wonder quite what it would do to get a government minister to resign. The public deserve to know how their money is being spent, and if contracts have been published, there's more transparency, and this idea of sunlight and disinfectant, that putting things out into the public domain reduces the risks of bad actors and of bad decisions being made. And it would make, if it was one or two contracts, but actually what we've seen, and not just during the pandemic, but it's got a lot worse during the pandemic, but it's been par for the course for many years, is contracts routinely published late, routinely published with key pieces of information missing, heavily redacted, really hard to get to understand how public money is being spent. So that's one part of this. But there's a much greater issue around transparency in government. At Open Democracy, we've been running a campaign around freedom of information, which hopefully some of your viewers might have heard about. We managed to get all these different Fleet Street editors last week to sign an open letter criticising the government's attitude towards freedom of information. Freedom of information, which is a right that everybody in this country should have, has never been harder to exercise. We've the lowest rate since freedom of information legislation was passed 20 years ago and came into force 5 years later. So we're seeing across government a serious issue of transparency. We're seeing routine documents not being published. Ministerial meetings aren't being published. If you look to find minutes of meetings, there's no minutes kept. So there's a serious problem with transparency. The National Audit Office, which is the government's own spending watchdog, it found that if you were a Conservative donor and you were put in what was called a VIP lane for contracts, you were 10 times more likely to get a government contract. So there's a real genuine issue with that. And it just so happens that the people most likely to get contracts, you've got contracts worth billions of pounds at this stage, are people who are very, very close to the government and close to governing the government party and senior government figures, which might make sense if many of them had a long history of providing the kind of services that they've got these contracts for. But in many cases, they don't. There was a big question about sourcing PPE, sourcing public personal protective equipment for frontline workers and for others. And the government, through the Department for Health and Social Care and the Cabinet Office, put out this big call. We want you to come and help us, asking companies to get in touch if they could help deliver PPE. And I spoke to some companies that were desperately trying to do this. They were people who were in clothing manufacturers in England, wanted to talk to the government, wanted to help, wanted to be able to provide PPE. And what was happening to them is they were calling up a dedicated hotline in the Cabinet Office, been run by the accountancy firm Deloitte. So Deloitte, when the pandemic hit, the Cabinet Office set up a bespoke unit, not staffed by civil service, but staffed by accountants from Deloitte and consultants. And these people couldn't get through. They were just getting onto this phone line from Deloitte. People were saying, we'll call you back. No one called them back. They had expertise and wanted to help. And they couldn't get through because they weren't kind of favored, basically. And I wrote that story and I started talking to people in the contract world to try and understand more about what was going on and to ask them about I actually specifically wanted to know the contract Deloitte had got to run this, under what auspices, and who'd made the decision to push like this very key issue of our pandemic response back, at the start of this, to procure PPE in the hands of an accountancy firm that not only had done a lot of work for government, but had very close links to government. Chloe Smith, the junior minister in the cabinet office before she became a government minister, before she became an MP, she worked for Deloitte, and that's not the only one. Many people in government have close links to accountancy firms. And there was no contract. Nothing was published. So that started me going, well, what's going on here? Why am I not able to find this out? And a lot of the work that I started doing, a lot of the contracts I started reporting on came from that. So I started looking at what was being published, but also started to report on what wasn't being published, because often what was happening was a company like Serco or something like that was already starting to do work, but there was no evidence of it because it hadn't been published. So you could see Serco doing things, but you couldn't find out what had happened. And what was really striking too is just how much of this was outsourced and outsourced again. It was basically outsourced and subcontracted. So the government decided very early to outsource big aspects of the pandemic response. So Deloitte was involved with trying to procure PPE. Serco was very involved with track and trace, but Serco had no experience with track and trace. So what it then did was subcontracted out this work. So we reckon about 30 different firms, but it's impossible to find out exactly because Serco wouldn't tell us, and Serco aren't subject to freedom of information laws. And we FOI'd the Department for Health and Social Care, but they said they didn't know because Serco was in charge of it. So what happened then? I ended up writing stories about people who worked in travel agents who are now doing track and trace and hadn't been given much medical training. And we're finding it really difficult and really genuinely personally stressful as well to try and do this job that was not in any way the job that they've been trained to do. And so I kind of started doing a lot of, it kind of snowballed from the early stories, but the more you looked, it felt like every rock you lifted up, there was real questions. And it wasn't just questions about transparency, although they were there. There was also questions just about efficacy. Was this working? The track and trace system, which was headed up by Dido Harding, which is she is a Tory peer, an unelected Tory peer is the nature of it. She'd previously had some really patchy business experience. She'd been the head of TalkTalk when they had a huge data leak, and she was kind of parachuted in. She was made the head of NHS track and trace. Ironically, her husband, John Penrose, is Boris Johnson's anti-corruption czar. And so that was the other fascinating thing about the work I found myself doing, is that there's not that many kind of the circles, the kind of degrees of separation between people are very, very, very small. You're only talking 1 or 2 degrees of separation in many instances.
What does this tell us about the wider issue of, the fact that vast amounts of public expenditure go to private contractors, to the private sector?
I think it's a real problem. I think in Britain there's been a tendency not to see it as a problem. I even think some of the words we use to describe the kind of thing we're talking about, chumocracy, chumopoly, all that sort of stuff. Like corruption is a different word and requires proof that someone had done something often illegal with the inducement of money. But cronyism, I think, is a perfectly reasonable word. Clientelism is a perfectly reasonable word. I think they are words that we can and should use about it. And I think there's a tendency in Britain not to see this. So just to take, for example, you're right. People can get lots of money as consultants, as former ministers, former politicians after they leave office. They don't actually have to wait till they leave office. You can still do it when you're in government. The revolving door. Sajid Javid, he resigned as the chancellor in February. I think it was in August he went to work for one of the big banks. I think it was JP Morgan, on a very, 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 very lucrative salary. And as are many others, they're the double jobbing. I think the revolving door is a massive problem because I think it really dents public confidence as well. So there's the one hand is how firm are you going to be on companies or on a sector that you think are going to employ you on a very nice little retainer on the other side of your political career? So there's a question about that, and I think that's a real question. Look at Nick Clegg going to work for Facebook. There's a real question about where politicians go to afterwards. But I think there's also there's a question that we don't ask enough as well about the impact that this kind of revolving door has just on the wider kind of politics and how people feel towards it. Because if that Theresa May, for example, gets paid hundreds of thousands of pounds to deliver after dinner speeches, a single after dinner speech. I'm not sure who wants 150 grand to listen to Theresa May speak. That does feel a little bit steep. And so what are people selling at that stage? Does anyone really believe that speech in itself is worth 150,000 pounds? And I think I think the revolving door is something that there hasn't been anything enough scrutiny on it, but also the very mechanics of it. We have this thing called ACABA, the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments, and it's got a great big title, but it has no teeth whatsoever. All it can do is say, don't do that. That's basically it. There are very few sanctions for breaking these rules. I was going to say laws, because they're not laws. Often they're just kind of parliamentary conventions. And the problem is it comes from the top. Boris Johnson, almost more than anybody else, has broken these sort of rules. You know, for example, if as a former minister, when someone leaves office for 2 years, they're supposed to tell ACABA, this business committee, what they're going to do if they're going to take up a new appointment. Boris Johnson, 3 days after he left the Foreign Secretary's job, signed a £250,000 a year deal with the Daily Telegraph to write a column. He never went near ACABA. ACABA then said, you shouldn't have done that, you're a very naughty boy. That's it. And the problem is when the kind of culture from the top is like this, and I agree, this isn't totally new. This has happened. You know, there's a tendency, I think, almost to think of some prelapsarian moment of British politics when everything was lovely. And I don't subscribe to that. And this is not, you know, in many ways, we've had cash for access scandals dating back decades. But I do think when you have somebody at the top of politics who shows such a lax regard for basic rules and regulations around transparency and proper behavior, it makes it even harder. And I think it does make the job of people like me, journalists who are discovering this information, putting it out into the public domain, much more difficult too, because you are hoping that some of this stuff will stop ultimately. It's one of the reasons you do it. I do get concerned when I see some of the stories recently about Labour funding and Labour donors, that rather than wanting to take big money out of politics, Labour is actually going, well, how do we try and attract similar donations? And I think the role of big money in politics and the way it warps British politics is really, really underappreciated, under interrogation. We don't really ask, well, when someone's giving lots of money to politics, and what are they getting out of it? And sometimes it's an ideological position, but just so happens, if you look at like the most recent and over the last 5, 10 years or 20 years, appointments to the House of Lords, it's really uncanny quite how many happen to be political donors. Such a chance. Similarly with COVID contracting, you know, it's remarkable how often you went back and you went into the weeds of a company and you saw, well, there's a political donor involved in that company. Well, you know, again, what's the chances? Not that many people give money to political parties. So I think, you know, if I was being optimistic, I would say there are things we could do. There's, you know, there's lots of legislation and actually in America, they've been good at drafting some of this legislation. It hasn't got passed yet. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But to try and start to take money out of politics. Because if we don't, I do worry that we're going to end up in a place where, you know, both trust is gone and we see all politicians the same. And the idea of change itself, the idea of like kind of political participation as something that will generate change, starts to kind of ebb and erode away. And that, I think, is a really dangerous place